It began with something too small to matter. A single nickel that shouldn't have existed. In 1953 Brooklyn, a boy dropped his change and cracked open the Cold War. Inside that hollow coin was no treasure, only numbers, patterns, silence. Proof that the war between superpowers wasn't fought on battlefields, but in secrets hidden inside pocket change. Years later, a man walked into the US Embassy in Paris, shaking, terrified, and carrying the truth. A spy turned defector, a cipher unlocked, and a trail that led straight to a quiet photographer in Brooklyn. A man who wasn't a man at all. It started with curiosity. It ended with an exchange on a frozen bridge, where two men crossed paths, each trading silence for survival. Because in the Cold War, even a coin could carry a secret. In the summer of 1953, Brooklyn pulsed with its usual hum of life. Trolley bells, distant radios, the clang of doors closing on crowded stoops. Children played stickball on cracked asphalt. And in the late light of June, a young newsboy named Jimmy pedaled through the quiet streets of Foster Avenue with a canvas bag heavy with folded copies of the Brooklyn Eagle. He was 13, restless, and unaware that history was about to lean down into his small, ordinary world. The evening rounds were routine. He stopped at 3403 Foster Avenue, a red brick apartment building that smelled faintly of dust and varnish. When he knocked on a customer's door, a middle-aged woman appeared with a dollar bill in hand. "Sorry, Jimmy," she said kindly. "I don't have any change." "Can you break this?" Jimmy checked his pockets. A scatter of coins, not enough to make change. "I'll ask across the hall," he said, and bounded down the corridor. Two elderly women there smiled, rummaging through purses, their bracelets clinking. They pulled a few coins to help him out. "Here you go, sweetheart," one said, pressing the nickel and quarters into his palm. He thanked them, tucked the coins away, and continued his rounds. The building's hallway lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in pale yellow. As Jimmy stepped outside, he juggled the coins in his hand, the rhythmic clink echoing faintly in the evening air. And then, one sound didn't match the rest. He stopped. The nickel had a hollow ring to it, lighter, sharper, as though the metal were thin. Curious, he rested it on his fingertip. It felt wrong. He dropped it on the sidewalk to test the sound again, and when it struck the concrete, the coin split neatly in two. Inside lay something no child had ever seen. A tiny circular photograph, barely larger than a pinhead, rolled tight as a hair and gleaming under the fading sun. He stared at it, his heartbeat quickening, unable to make sense of what he held. It wasn't paper money, and it wasn't a trick. The numbers on the photo were too small to read, as if meant for machines, not people. Jimmy showed it to his parents, who puzzled over it but dismissed it as some sort of novelty. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. The boy who found the magic coin. It might have ended there, another Brooklyn curiosity, if not for an offhand conversation 2 days later. A local police officer, hearing of the story from a friend's daughter, mentioned it to a detective in the New York City Police Department. "You ever hear of a hollow nickel?" he asked. "Some kid says one popped open." The detective raised an eyebrow. Strange, but worth a look. The next morning, he tracked down Jimmy, who handed over the coin and its strange photograph. By June 24th, 1953, the hollow nickel sat on a wooden desk inside the FBI's New York field office. Agents turned it over under a lamp, studying the perfect precision of its halves. "Whoever made this," one said, "wasn't doing magic tricks." The microphotograph was analyzed under magnification. It revealed 10 columns of numbers, 5 digits each, lined in tight formation, 21 rows to a column. No words, no names, just a cold pattern of digits that spoke in silence. The agents exchanged glances. "This," one murmured, "looks like a cipher." The nickel was carefully wrapped, labeled, and flown to Washington for full analysis at the FBI laboratory. There, under controlled light and magnifying scopes, forensic experts examined its every contour. They discovered the front half bore the face of a 1948 Jefferson nickel, but the reverse came from another coin, a wartime mint between 1942 and 1945, made from copper and silver alloy instead of nickel. The two halves fit together with such precision that the scene was invisible to the naked eye. Only under extreme magnification could the fine line be traced, a craftsmanship too deliberate to be coincidence. A technician noted a minuscule puncture in the R of the word trust, a hidden release point. Insert a pin, and the halves would separate cleanly, revealing the cavity inside. Within that hollow space, the tiny film had been placed with surgical accuracy. The discovery sparked quiet unease inside the bureau. Hollow coins existed. Stage magicians sometimes used them, but never with this kind of technical perfection. "This is tradecraft," a senior agent said. "Professional, not American." While cryptanalysts worked to decode the message, field agents fanned out across New York, retracing the coin's path. They visited every resident in the Foster Avenue building, interviewed shopkeepers, and questioned the women who'd handed Jimmy the change. All insisted they'd never seen such a coin. None could recall where their own coins had come from. The trail ended in the dull anonymity of everyday commerce. For weeks, agents searched for other hollow coins, anything that matched the design. They contacted novelty stores, coin collectors, and magicians, even pawn shops. Nothing matched the craftsmanship of the Brooklyn nickel. One novelty dealer examined the photographs and shook his head. "If that's a trick coin," he said, "it's made by someone who doesn't want it found." Back in Washington, cryptographers examined the microfilm daily, feeding its sequences into primitive machines, comparing patterns, calculating frequencies. No codebook matched. The typewriter that had produced the numbers wasn't American. Either its spacing and alignment suggested foreign manufacture. Soviet, perhaps, but proof remained elusive. Years began to pass, and the hollow nickel became a ghost of an unsolved puzzle. Locked in the Bureau's vault, it waited, its secret intact, its message unread. Agents moved on to new cases. The Cold War deepened. McCarthyism burned across the nation, paranoia swelling in headlines. But still, no one knew what the nickel truly meant. Behind closed doors, senior officials debated its significance. "If it's espionage," one said, "then somewhere in this country, a foreign agent is waiting for an answer he'll never get." And yet the Bureau did not forget. They cataloged the coin under Unknown Espionage Object, 1953, a title as enigmatic as the coin itself. For 4 years, the hollow nickel slept beneath layers of glass and dust as the world turned and alliances hardened. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in the corridors of Soviet intelligence, messages continued to move in whispers and code, unseen by those who walked past them every day. Then, in 1957, 4 years after a boy's curiosity had cracked open a mystery, a nervous man in Paris would step forward and finally breathe life into the secret that lay hidden inside that nickel. His name was Reino Hayhanen, and he was about to tell the United States what that small piece of metal truly meant. In the spring of 1957, a cold rain washed over Paris, turning the boulevards to mirrors of gray light. The American embassy loomed behind wrought iron gates, its windows fogged from the damp. Inside, just after dawn, a lone figure stepped through the entrance, hat brim dripping, coat clinging to his shoulders. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. He introduced himself as Eugene Nikolai Maki, an American by birth. But his voice carried an accent not of Idaho or New York. It was Eastern European, soft and uncertain. When the Marine Guard asked his business, the man answered quietly, "I need to speak to someone from intelligence." Moments later, in a sterile interview room upstairs, he set a passport and a thin folder on the table. "My real name," he said, "is Reino Hayhanen. I am an officer of the Soviet Intelligence Service. For 5 years I have operated inside the United States. I cannot return to Moscow." Those words fell into the room like lead. The two American officials exchanged glances, silent but alert. In the thick hush of Cold War diplomacy, no statement carried more danger or more value. Haynen's hands trembled as he reached for a cigarette. The flame from the lighter flickered across his tired face, revealing deep lines for a man only in his 30s. "They recalled me," he murmured. "I know what that means. I will not make it home alive." His story unfolded over hours, and as the rain drummed against the windows, the world of espionage began to take shape in the Americans' minds. An invisible war fought in alleys, basements, and quiet rooms. Hayhanen described his recruitment by the Soviet NKVD, later the KGB, during the final months of the Finnish-Soviet War. Fluent in Finnish, he had served as an interpreter, then as an informant. After the war, he was drawn deeper into the machinery of state security, learning surveillance, recruitment, and code work. In 1948, he was summoned to Moscow. "They told me I was chosen for an assignment abroad," he said. "They gave me a new language, a new history, and a new life." The KGB trained him to become Eugene Maki, a man who had once existed, a child born in Idaho in 1919, whose family had left America decades earlier for the Soviet Union and vanished behind the Iron Curtain. The real Maki had died years before. The false one was now standing before them, breathing proof of Soviet infiltration. Through months of preparation, Hayhanen had studied English until he spoke it with the flat vowels of the Midwest. He learned to develop microfilm, photograph documents in miniature, and encrypt messages with precision. Every detail, he said, down to the kind of cigarettes my cover would smoke. In October 1952, posing as an American returning home, he boarded the Queen Mary in Southampton and arrived in New York Harbor 5 days later. He lived quietly, taking small jobs, sending occasional coded messages to Moscow through dead drops, secret hiding spots in public places. He was not alone. Others moved around him, unseen, each contact known only by a code name. "There was one above me," he told the agents, "a man we called Mikhail. He met me in the subway, in Prospect Park, sometimes under the bridge near Macomb's Dam. Always briefly, always cautious." The Americans listened, taking notes in careful silence. Hayhanen described their communication system, invisible signals placed in the city's landscape. A red tack pinned to a signpost near Tavern on the Green meant he had arrived safely. A white tack meant danger. Packages were left in hollow bolts, under lampposts, or behind bricks loosened just enough to hide a film capsule. Then, he said something that made one of the men at the table sit forward. "We also used coins," Hayhanen explained. "Hollow coins. Inside, microfilm with instructions or coded numbers." The room stilled. For the first time in 4 years, the FBI's forgotten mystery had a voice. When shown a photograph of the 1948 Jefferson nickel discovered in Brooklyn, Hayhanen's expression changed. He stared at it for a long moment before nodding. "Yes," he said softly, "that is one of ours." He explained that the nickel contained a message sent to him from Moscow shortly after his arrival in America. A routine transmission of instructions and confirmation of his safe arrival. But somehow, the message had gone astray. He never received it. "It must have been lost before it reached me," he said. Whoever carried it, he failed. FBI headquarters in Washington confirmed every detail of his confession. Forensic analysts re-examined the microfilm from the hollow nickel, this time with Hayhanen's guidance. Within days, the code was finally broken. It read like a bureaucratic telegram, almost mundane, but its implications were staggering. "We congratulate you on a safe arrival. Transmit short letters separately. Consult with us prior to investing. Greetings from the comrades." Beneath the plain language was confirmation that the Soviet Union had placed deep cover operatives on American soil, living under forged American identities, communicating through microscopic ciphers hidden in pocket change. Hayhanen continued his account, piecing together a map of his covert world. After 2 years, Mikhail had vanished from New York. In his place came another contact. Older, sharper, more methodical. He called himself Mark, Hayhanen said. He was no diplomat. He was something higher. Mark was the one who handled larger operations, who assigned Hayhanen to gather information on industrial facilities, military equipment, and personnel. Sometimes Mark gave him rolls of film or currency. Other times, coded notes concealed in hollow batteries or pencils. He was careful, Hayhanen recalled. Always calm, always watching. When Moscow recalled Hayhanen in 1957, Mark arranged his travel. They said it was a temporary meeting, he admitted. But I know the truth. They were dissatisfied. I drank too much. I made mistakes. No one returns from such a recall. So he ran, first to Helsinki, then to Paris, and finally to the embassy where he now sat, exhausted and shaking, placing his life in the hands of the country he had once been sent to betray. Within days, the US quietly exfiltrated Hayhanen to New York, under protection. He was questioned for weeks in a secure location, offering names, codes, and fragments of his espionage network. Piece by piece, a picture formed of the man known as Mark, a veteran Soviet colonel living under the alias Emil Goldfus, operating a photography studio in Brooklyn. It was there, Hayhanen said, that Mark kept his equipment, shortwave radios, cipher books, microdot cameras, and containers designed to hide secrets in plain sight. He described the entrance, the smell of developing chemicals, the locked drawers. He was a master of concealment, Hayhanen said. You could stand in that room and never know you were surrounded by messages. FBI agents listened, building a case in the quiet rhythm of patience. If we can find this man, one agent said, we find the network. By May of 1957, surveillance teams in New York began their silent work, men in parked cars, cameras hidden behind newspapers, eyes trained on a small studio at 252 Fulton Street. The discovery that had begun 4 years earlier with a curious boy and a hollow nickel was no longer a mystery. It had become a hunt. And somewhere in the narrow streets of Brooklyn, under the buzz of street lights and the hum of the city, Colonel Rudolph Ivanovich Abel, the man called Mark, was still at work, unaware that the coin he had once sent had come back to expose him. The summer of 1957 arrived in New York like a slow exhale, humid, heavy, restless. The city was alive with the usual rhythm of subways, sirens, and endless conversations. But somewhere beneath the noise, another kind of silence lingered. The silence of men who watched without being seen. On a street lined with pawn shops and corner cafes, the FBI began its vigil. The target, a modest photography studio at 252 Fulton Street, a nondescript building near downtown Brooklyn. The name on the door read Emil Goldfus, photographer. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing that screamed espionage. Yet every detail the Bureau had gathered, from Hayhanen's trembling confessions to coded fragments of microfilm, pointed to this quiet address. Agents took turns watching from a car parked down the block, cameras hidden beneath newspapers, lenses peeking through cracks in the windows. Day after day, they noted the same routine. Goldfuss arrived early, carrying a worn leather satchel, and stayed late into the night developing photographs. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and seemed to live without friends. His neighbors thought him polite, if distant, the kind of man who nodded on the stairwell but never invited conversation. At first glance, he appeared almost painfully ordinary, graying hair, wire-framed glasses, neatly pressed suits. But to the agents keeping watch, he was a phantom. He paid his rent in cash. He received no mail. He made no calls from his home. It was as though the life of Emil Goldfus existed only in the surface reflection of the city around him. Look at him, one agent whispered as they watched through binoculars. You'd never know. Inside his studio, Abel, for that was his real name, moved with deliberate precision. He mixed chemicals for development, filed negatives, and sometimes paused to stare out the window, eyes distant, calculating. His hands, steady and clean, betrayed none of the tension that followed him. On the walls hung innocuous portraits of families, sailors, and young couples. Behind them, hidden compartments contained far more dangerous material. Ciphers, film canisters, hollow containers, and a shortwave radio capable of reaching Moscow under the cover of static. Abel knew surveillance as instinct. Every morning he changed his route to work, occasionally doubling back to see if he was being followed. He never spoke to the same shopkeeper twice in a week, never lingered in one cafe too long. To passers-by, he was invisible, just another middle-aged man in a city that forgot faces overnight. But patience was the Bureau's greatest weapon. Weeks of observation built patterns. Notes became maps. Small anomalies became clues. And slowly, the ordinary began to fracture. Agents traced Abel's movements to a hotel on East 28th Street, where he sometimes spent the night under another name, Martin Collins. The handwriting on the registration card was identical to that on his studio ledger. When questioned, the hotel staff remembered him only vaguely. Quiet man, good manners. Paid cash. Meanwhile, FBI field technicians sifted through evidence from Hayhanen's past dead drops. One, in Prospect Park, had long been sealed with cement by a city repair crew. When they dug it open, They found a hollow bolt containing a slip of paper preserved inside. The typewritten message read, "Nobody came to meeting either 8th or 9th. Place seems right. Please check." The code matched Heenan's story exactly. And the style, the phrasing, the rhythm was consistent with the man who called himself Mark. By June, surveillance intensified. The Bureau no longer doubted who Goldfus truly was. Colonel Rudolph Ivanovich Abel, a decorated Soviet intelligence officer operating illegally on American soil since 1948. The order was given: observe, confirm, and prepare for arrest. Night fell on June 13, 1957. The lights in Abel's studio glowed faintly through the curtains. 2 agents watched from across the street, their breaths fogging the windshield. At precisely 10 o'clock, the window darkened. Moments later, a figure stepped into the humid air outside the building. He moved calmly, a small suitcase in hand, hat tilted low. "Target is mobile," one agent said quietly into the radio. They followed him through the flickering neon of Fulton Street, down into the subway, their footsteps drowned by the clatter of trains. Abel boarded the line to Manhattan, unaware that 2 pairs of eyes trailed him through every transfer, every platform. He emerged at 28th Street, walked 3 blocks, and disappeared into the lobby of the Hotel Latham. Inside, he signed the register, Martin Collins, and requested a quiet room on the 2nd floor. The agents didn't move that night. They kept their distance, patient and watchful. For the next week, Abel's life unfolded in patterns, careful, precise, the rhythm of a man used to control. He spent long hours writing at a small desk, listening to the radio, reading foreign newspapers. He left the hotel only for brief walks through the park, where he'd pause occasionally on a bench, scanning the crowd. But the agents noticed something else, an unease in his movements, a faint edge of suspicion. He seemed to sense the net tightening, even if he couldn't yet see it. When the arrest order came, it was delivered quietly, with the same cold professionalism that defined the Bureau's work. At dawn on June 21, 1957, 2 men entered the Hotel Latham. The hallway was still, the carpet muffling their steps. They stopped outside room 839. A knock. Silence. Another. Then the door opened. The man standing there looked calm, almost expectant. His suitcase was half-packed on the bed. Inside were brushes, cameras, and a roll of film wrapped in a handkerchief. "Mr. Collins?" one agent said. Abel studied them for a long moment. "I've used many names," he replied evenly. "Which one are you asking for?" "Rudolph Ivanovich Abel," came the answer. The faintest flicker crossed his face. Not fear, but acknowledgement. He nodded once, as though a long-delayed appointment had finally arrived. "You've done well," he said softly. "You must have had good help." He didn't resist as they placed him under arrest. The search of his studio revealed a hidden world: shortwave transmitters, cipher pads, microdot film, hollowed-out shaving brushes, and cufflinks designed to conceal messages. Each object was a chapter in a story that stretched across years and continents. For the agents, the case was no longer theoretical. It was tangible: metal, paper, film, and silence. A war fought in invisible ink and dead drops, where a boy's dropped coin had become the thread that unraveled a Soviet network. In the interrogation room, Abel sat under the harsh white light, expression unreadable. When asked to cooperate, he gave a faint smile. "I am a colonel of the Soviet army," he said quietly. "You know this already. You also know that I cannot answer your questions." There was no arrogance in his tone, only discipline, the kind that came from a lifetime of secrets. He spent the night in a small cell in Manhattan, the city sounds muted behind concrete. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the streets clean as if nothing had happened. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the headline, "Russian spy captured in New York." But inside the Bureau, there was little celebration, only the weight of what they'd uncovered. This was not the end of a case. It was the beginning of something far larger. For the first time, the Cold War had a face, and his name was Rudolph Ivanovich Abel. The courtroom on the 7th floor of the federal courthouse in Brooklyn was packed to the edges. Reporters filled the benches, their notebooks open, pencils ready. The smell of paper and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. At the center sat a man who looked more like an accountant than a spy. Gray suit pressed, glasses glinting under the overhead lights, expression calm, detached. Colonel Rudolph Ivanovich Abel, Soviet intelligence officer, now prisoner of the United States. When he entered the room for the first time, the cameras clicked like gunfire. He neither flinched nor smiled. He simply adjusted his tie and sat beside his attorney, James Donovan, a quiet, deliberate man chosen not for politics, but for principle. Donovan had been a Navy lawyer during World War II. He understood secrets, and he understood that justice, even in wartime, must be measured by law, not fear. From the prosecution table, U.S. Attorney William Foley laid out the charges: 3 counts of conspiracy, to transmit defense information, to obtain it unlawfully, and to act as an unregistered agent of a foreign power. The penalty, if convicted, could reach death. "Your Honor," Foley began, his voice sharp as steel, "this man is not merely a spy. He is a representative of a government dedicated to our destruction. He has operated within our borders for nearly a decade, under false identities, using invisible ink, coded microfilm, and hollow coins to communicate with Moscow. This case is not about ideology. It is about betrayal." Donovan rose slowly, unbuttoning his jacket. "Your Honor," he said, "the Constitution does not bend to ideology. If we deny this man his rights because of who he is, we deny what makes us different from those we oppose." The courtroom fell silent. The tone was set. Throughout the trial, Abel remained composed, unshaken by testimony, unbothered by the whispers of the gallery. He sat with hands folded, eyes steady on whoever spoke, as if studying each person with clinical detachment. When Reino Hayhanen took the stand, the room leaned forward. The defector's face was pale under the lights, his voice uneven. He recounted everything: the coded exchanges, the dead drops, the bolts hidden in park steps, the hollow coins used to carry microfilm. He pointed once toward Abel. "That man," he said, his accent thick, "was my superior. We called him Mark." The defense did not challenge the facts. The evidence was overwhelming. Abel's handwriting matched coded notes. His studio was filled with espionage tools, and Haynen's story fit the timeline like a lock finding its key. Donovan instead built a different argument, one not of denial, but of dignity. He questioned the methods, not the motives. "Do we become stronger," he asked the jury, "by treating even our enemies with fairness? Or do we weaken ourselves when fear becomes our guide?" Outside the courthouse, fear was already running wild. The New York Times called Abel the most dangerous foreign agent ever caught on American soil. Radio hosts demanded the death penalty. Members of Congress called for swift execution. But inside the courtroom, Donovan kept the proceedings grounded in the calm mechanics of justice. The rule of law, he told the jury, is not a luxury. It is the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Abel listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Only once did he speak directly to his attorney, in a low tone. "I accept whatever comes," he said. "If I were in your position, I would do the same." In cross-examination, the prosecution pressed Hayhanen for every incriminating detail. They displayed photos of Abel's equipment, cipher pads, radios, cameras, a hollow shaving brush, cufflinks designed to hold microdots. Each object was evidence of a man who lived entirely in deception. And yet, Abel never betrayed emotion. Even when a former army sergeant named Roy Rhodes, turned Soviet informant, was revealed through Abel's microfilm, the accused sat quietly, adjusting his glasses as if the words were lines in a book he had already read. The trial lasted nearly 3 weeks. Each day, the tension coiled tighter, not only around Abel's fate, but around the question of who America would choose to be in that moment. In the corridors, whispers spread that the case had reached Moscow. The Soviets remained silent, denying any connection to Abel, yet the KGB watched closely. They knew he would never talk. When the jury retired for deliberation, the courtroom emptied into a humid September afternoon. Reporters clustered on the courthouse steps, their voices overlapping. "What's your guess, Bill? They'll hang him for sure. Not if Donovan keeps him alive." The jury returned after only a few hours. The courtroom filled again, every seat taken, every breath held. Abel stood when the clerk read the verdict. On count 1, guilty. On count 2, guilty. On count 3, guilty. The words echoed, and Abel gave a single nod, not of submission, but of acknowledgement, as though confirming that the game had reached its inevitable move. Donovan rested a hand briefly on the table, then looked at his client. Abel leaned over and whispered, "You did your duty." When the gavel struck, the headlines wrote themselves. Soviet spy found guilty on all counts. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later, before Judge Mortimer Byers, a man whose patience had been tested by months of pressure from Washington and public opinion alike. The courtroom that day was quieter. Fewer reporters, more officials in dark suits. The air was thick with the gravity of history. Judge Byers began slowly, his voice measured. "This court has been asked to decide between punishment and preservation. The crimes of which you have been convicted are grave. Espionage against this nation, against its people, against the very trust upon which we build our freedom." He paused, eyes meeting Abel's. "Yet, if I were to impose the maximum penalty, I might deprive this country of a future bargaining tool should one of our own fall into similar hands." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutors glanced at each other, surprised. "The sentence of this court," Byers continued, "is as follows. On count 1, 30 years imprisonment. On count 2, 10 years and a fine of $2,000. On count 3, 5 years and a fine of $1,000. Sentences to run concurrently." A hush fell. 30 years. No execution, no gallows. Abel inclined his head, his composure unbroken. As guards stepped forward, Donovan stood beside him. "You will be remembered," he said softly. Abel gave a faint smile. "Perhaps," he replied, "but not by name." As he was led from the courtroom, flashbulbs burst in white streaks. Reporters shouted questions. None were answered. The door closed behind him, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the uneasy sense that justice had been both served and postponed. Outside, James Donovan faced the press. "I defended him," he said simply, "because the rule of law must apply even when it is hardest to uphold. If we lose that, we lose everything." In Moscow, the story was buried in silence. Abel's name was erased from official record, his capture labeled disinformation. To the KGB, he was gone. To America, he was a prisoner. But in truth, he had become something else entirely, a symbol of two nations locked in a war, fought not with armies, but with secrets. In his cell at the Federal Detention Center in Atlanta, Rudolph Abel began to paint, small watercolors of birds, landscapes, and faces from memory. The guards said he was polite, quiet, almost gentle. But his eyes remained alert, always searching, as though listening to a frequency no one else could hear. He did not know it then, but history had not finished with him. In 5 years' time, the man condemned as a spy would walk again beneath an open sky, not as a free man, but as a bargaining chip in a silent negotiation between superpowers. Winter settled over Berlin like a shroud. The city stood divided, a scar of concrete and wire splitting east from west, ideology from ideology. The wind carried the smell of coal smoke and cold iron. Searchlights swept across the no-man's land where footsteps were forbidden. It was here, on a gray stretch of steel, called the Glynnick Bridge, that history would at last exhale the secret it had been holding since a boy in Brooklyn dropped a nickel 9 years before. By early 1962, Colonel Rudolph Ivanovich Abel had served nearly 5 years of his 30-year sentence in the federal penitentiary at Atlanta. He lived as he had always done, quietly, methodically. He painted watercolors of birds, wrote short letters in precise script, and never complained. To the guards he was courteous, even kind. But there was a stillness about him that made conversation drift away. He carried himself like a man awaiting the next order, not the end of the line. Far away, another prisoner sat in a cell. Francis Gary Powers, the American U-2 pilot shot down over Soviet territory in 1960. His capture had humiliated Washington and fed Moscow's propaganda machine. 2 men, 2 worlds, each holding what the other wanted. And so, in the secrecy of diplomatic channels, a negotiation began. President Kennedy's advisors whispered of an exchange. The Soviets hinted through intermediaries that they would consider releasing Powers if Abel were returned. It was delicate, unspeakable in public. To the American public, Abel was still the Red Spy. Any deal would invite outrage. But to the men who measured victory in intelligence, not headlines, the logic was clear. A living spy was currency. A dead one was nothing. James Donovan, the same lawyer who had defended Abel when no one else would, was summoned quietly by the CIA. His instructions were clear, and his destination colder than any courtroom: East Berlin. He traveled alone, a civilian negotiator moving through the fog of divided Europe, carrying in his briefcase the faint hope of balance. On the night of February 9, 1962, a heavy mist rolled over the River Havel. Snow clung to the iron beams of the bridge, turning its rails to pale lines against the dark. At each end stood armed guards, Soviet soldiers to the east, American MPs to the west. Between them lay 100 yards of neutral ground and the weight of two superpowers staring across the void. In an unmarked car on the western approach, Abel sat between two U.S. agents. He wore a wool coat and a black fedora, his face thinner, his eyes unchanged. He gazed out the window, watching the lights blur past. "Do you feel ready for this?" one agent asked. Abel's mouth curved slightly. "I am always ready," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You should tell your pilot the same." Across the bridge, in another car, Gary Powers sat with Soviet officials, his hands folded tightly around a small Bible. He looked older than his 32 years, worn by interrogation and isolation. The Soviets treated him as a trophy. To the Americans, he was a symbol of what could still be saved. As dawn broke over the frozen river, Donovan arrived on foot, his breath clouding in the cold. He met with the East German lawyer Wolfgang Vogel, the intermediary who had choreographed every step of the exchange. They spoke in low voices, checking details for the final time. "Abel walks first," Vogel said. "When he reaches the midpoint, Powers follows. No one crosses fully until both are seen." The order went through radios on both sides. The bridge fell silent. Even the wind seemed to wait. From the American end, Abel stepped out of the car. The snow crunched beneath his shoes. He buttoned his coat, adjusted his scarf, and began to walk. Each step echoed faintly against the steel girders, the sound carrying across the water like a heartbeat. His posture was upright, soldierly. He did not look back. From the far side, Powers emerged, hesitant at first, then steady, his boots slipping slightly on the ice. Between them, in the exact center of the bridge, a line of frost glistened under the searchlights. For a moment, both men paused, two silhouettes in the gray dawn, facing what neither could truly see. Abel stopped, hands in his pockets, watching the Americans beyond the line. Powers drew nearer until their paths met by the faded midpoint marker. The guards tensed. Cameras clicked from a hidden distance. Then, without words, each man stepped past the other, crossing into the future that awaited him. It was over in less than a minute. But in that minute, 9 years of secrets, fear, and silence passed from one side of history to the other. When Abel reached the Soviet car, he turned once toward the Americans. His face was expressionless, though a glimmer of something, pride, perhaps sorrow, crossed his eyes. He didn't look angry, one observer later said. He looked complete. The car door closed, and the convoy rolled slowly into the mist, disappearing toward East Berlin. On the opposite end, Gary Powers was met with handshakes, questions, and flashes of light. Abel made no statements, no gestures of victory. To him, the mission was not triumph or failure, merely concluded. In Washington, the official line was restrained. The State Department confirmed an exchange of detained persons and refused further comment. In Moscow, state newspapers carried only a brief notice: Soviet citizen R.I. Abel has returned home. Nothing more. But inside the KGB, Abel's return was quietly celebrated. He was debriefed for months, honored for silence under captivity, and eventually restored to rank. Those who met him later said he spoke little of America. He admired their organization, one colleague recalled. He said they were efficient and patient. James Donovan returned to the United States the following week, anonymous in the crowd at Idlewild Airport. He refused interviews, though one reporter caught him long enough to ask, "Was he what you expected?" Donovan paused, his coat still dusted with Berlin snow. "He was exactly what I expected," he said. A professional. Years later, when the Cold War began to thaw, historians would look back on the hollow nickel case as one of the strangest beginnings to one of the most symbolic endings. From a child's curiosity on a Brooklyn sidewalk to a silent exchange on a frozen bridge, it traced the invisible thread connecting ordinary lives to the vast machinery of nations. The hollow nickel itself rests today in the FBI Museum, sealed in glass. Under the lights, it gleams faintly, its seam almost imperceptible. Visitors peer at it, trying to imagine how something so small could carry such consequence. A coin no heavier than any other, yet weighted with the gravity of history. For Abel, that coin had been routine, another vessel in a long chain of coded communication. For the boy who found it, it was a curiosity. For the world, it became proof that the war of shadows was real. And so, on that cold February morning in 1962, as the mist swallowed the last echoes of footsteps on Glenicke Bridge, the story of the hollow nickel came quietly to rest. No gunfire, no victory speeches. Only two men walking in opposite directions, vanishing into the fog, each carrying the silence of his nation. One toward freedom, the other toward loyalty, both toward history. Like, share, and subscribe.